everyone, and welcome back. It is finally time to get to the third installment of my 101 series, where we're going to talk about cotton. Cotton is the natural fiber that is the most common in modern households and in modern wardrobes. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot to learn about it, and particularly when it comes to different types of cotton, they actually get really complex and rather mixed up as to what is termed what type of textile. So let's get into that and start to break it all down, starting with what cotton actually is. Cotton is a cellulosic fiber, meaning that it is a plant fiber. It comes from a bush-like plant. It varies around the world as to exactly what size and appearance that is. And as the seeds grow on these plants, they are surrounded by these balls of sort of fluffy fibers in order to protect them. The actual fibers themselves vary from particular plant to particular plant, and we have actually gone through massive cultivation of the different species of cotton over thousands of years. Cotton, just like the other natural fibers, is very, very old, meaning that we have literal scraps of it dating back to the 6th century BCE. We found evidence of it that far back in Pakistan and Peru and other places around the world shortly following that. So it is a very ancient textile, and it originates from a few different locations around the world. There are 4 main species of cotton. In Mesoamerica, you have G. hirsutum. In South America, you have G. barbadense. In Africa, there is G. herbaceum. And in Asia, there is G. arboreum. All 4 of these species vary in terms of their overall size and appearance, and have been cultivated to look dramatically different than they did even just a couple thousand years ago. Most of the cultivation that has taken place was done in order to have longer, brighter, and fluffier fibers. Even though we are used to cotton being something that is white to off-white in its natural state, natural cotton in all of its different varieties can actually come in a whole range of colors. There's green and pink and a whole range of yellows through to browns that you can find historically. A lot of these are much harder to find today. A great example of this is nankeen cotton. Nankeen is a yellow cotton that comes from the Asiatic region, and it was all over in the 18th century, and it was really, really commonly used for all sorts of things. I found it in shoes as well as menswear and a whole variety of different fashionable items. You can't find it anymore. Believe me, it just isn't really common. There are some nankeen cottons that are very locally grown in Japan. Usually they are then indigo dyed, so they aren't grown for their original color like you're used to seeing them in the 18th century. I'd still like to actually go over there and look for them, but in terms of what's available easily, that one's pretty much disappeared. In fact, many of the varieties of cotton have pretty much disappeared at this point. The specific type that we use is called the American upland, and that makes up 90% of all cotton production globally. So we have a pretty monochromatic type of cotton availability at this point in time. One of the things that if you grew up in America, you might remember discussing in school is that of Eli Whitney and his cotton gin invention, which I'm not sure how much they might have taught you, but most of the time I wasn't taught that he didn't really invent the cotton gin, he just invented a cotton gin, specifically for that American upland cotton. Because while it produced a more ideal fiber, it was really difficult to actually process the fiber. It was kind of sticky. Compared to all of the other fibers for cotton that were out there, it was extra complex to deal with. So that specific cotton gin wasn't invented until the late 18th century, and that's what made that cotton grow in terms of its popularity. However, cotton gins as a general concept date way further back. There's evidence of single roller cotton gins as of the 6th century, and double roller gins, like what we're used to seeing today, actually come around in India and China almost 1,000 years ago. So they've been around for quite a while, much longer than Eli Whitney's gin. They just were for a specific type of cotton. While cotton was obviously popular and common in many of the regions where it grew naturally, it didn't really make its way over to Europe until around the 10th century. It grew slowly from there, and by the time we reach the 17th century, the desire and demand for cotton had started to explode very rapidly. In fact, so much so that there were concerns in Europe over the competition of cotton grown outside of and processed outside of their countries and then being imported in. So there were actually laws put into place by both Britain and France at the end of the 17th century to start levying extra taxes and fees on importing cotton. Eventually there were actually bans in place, sometimes on specific things like printed cotton, but raw cotton could be imported and finished in Britain, for example. And a lot of the times there were exceptions for the cotton that was coming through the country to be then exported over to the colonies like America. And it wasn't really until the end of the 18th century that those laws were lifted, and cotton absolutely exploded as a popular textile. Partner this with the factor of things like Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which really brought cotton to the forefront in the US, because prior to that it was a slow, laborious process. There wasn't a lot of production. Land was not being prioritized for cotton. It went to lots of different products all over the South. And when that gin came along, suddenly it was profitable to grow cotton and process cotton. And in many ways, this is thought of as the reason that slavery continued in the United States in the way that it did, because prior to that point, the actual economic value of the crops that were being grown in the southern US, like indigo and rice, was actually not doing all that well. They were not making as much money as they really needed to in order to support the lifestyle that they had set up. But it is a major part of the US history and is something that is really important to understand. As per always, there is so much more to the history of cotton than I can go into at the moment, so there are some links to books below that I have read and highly recommend. There are actually links as well to previews of them, just in case you can't go out and buy the whole book right now. But of course, this boom that we all know of with cotton in the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution was massive, and it continued into the 20th century and still affects us today. Most of the production of cotton is done in India and China. The US is third in terms of the actual growing of cotton, but almost all of the raw cotton is then exported to places like India and China because we don't have the manufacturing here to actually go through the entire process of making it into a textile. So most of the textiles are coming out of India and China at this point in time, though there are lots of other countries that specialize in this as well. And there are more than there used to be, even though cotton is not the easiest fiber to grow in the fact that it requires a ton of water, so much water, by far the thirstiest of all of the fiber options. There are still going to be places that wouldn't be able to grow it before that are just using irrigation now. So it has spread out over the globe in terms of where we actually grow it, and has moved around over the years in terms of where it is commonly produced. One of the places that it is commonly being produced today, in fact 20% of all cotton production comes out of this region, is in Xinjiang, China. And this is one of those areas that you might have heard before because it is definitely a current controversy. A lot of the labor that is there is likely forced labor from the Muslim and other minority populations in the area. So cotton definitely has some ethical issues at the current moment, and some places are putting a lot of effort forward to make sure that they talk about where they are getting their cotton produced and making sure that they are getting it produced ethically. But this is something to be aware of in the current state of this particular fiber, which, as I said, is absolutely everywhere in the modern home. So with all of that in mind, what does cotton actually do for us as a textile? Well, for one thing, it is actually stronger when it is wet, so it holds up well in that regard. It is also something that is incredibly easy to dye. So you can produce amazingly bright and brilliant fast colors out of this textile, and it's really easy to process. It's great to be blended into lots of things. It is a short staple fiber, meaning that it's only, in this case, a couple inches long on average. So this is something that is really easy to blend into other fibers, such as wool or synthetics, in order to get a different texture, to get an easier dyeing process, to get a more natural feel to it, to get all sorts of other benefits from it. There are some downsides to cotton though, as I believe I mentioned in the linen 101 from last time. Cotton has a tendency to hold onto bacteria and odors in a way that, say, linen does not, so that is something to be aware of, especially with your summer clothing. It can hold up to being bleached and washed pretty hard. It isn't really susceptible to heat and wrinkling in the same way. If you have it in prolonged heat over 150 degrees, then it can start to deteriorate, but as long as you aren't dealing with stuff on super hot levels, cotton is fairly sturdy and fairly long-lasting in that regard. The actual wear and tear, because they are shorter fibers, it gets a little bit complex, but it is an easy fiber to deal with from a manufacturing standpoint. And today, especially in modern day, almost all of the equipment that is out there for fabric production for natural fibers is really aimed at cotton. It is such a big industry and there's so much produced. Even things like linen are sometimes broken down into smaller fibers so that way they can be processed on the cotton machinery. So it kind of makes sense why cotton is a very strong contender in our modern wardrobe, just because the world, the manufacturing, everything is set up for that, regardless of how much damage it does to the environment or any other ethical issues. It's just easy to produce, it's easy to dye, and it is an easy wear textile. It doesn't wrinkle like linen does, it doesn't require dry cleaning like silk or wool do, so it is an easy to care for fiber. That's why it's so popular today. When it comes to different types of textiles that get made out of cotton, there is a surprisingly large variety, and not just of textiles that are 100% cotton and are defined by that, but cotton seems to have taken over previous textiles from a lot of other fibers. So there are things that were once 100% linen that are now commonly made out of cotton, and that's really all you're going to normally find. So we're going to hear a lot of names that we might have heard before, but they might mean different things now. And on top of that, cotton gets blended into a lot of things, so there's only so much that I can really list off here. I'm going to try to go with the ones that you most commonly are going to find, but cotton blends is such a massive topic, and the things like damask and jacquard that we talked about in the silk video with their complex weaving, those are also done in cotton now too. Historically, not, but modern day they are, because you can produce a good heavier weight for things like furniture and draperies. So upholstery is a really big business and cotton is a really big part of that textile industry. But we're going to start off with the cotton that we probably all encounter the most often if you go to the fabric store or just generally look at the world around you, quilting cotton. This comes in a variety of different weights, and this is what you're going to find when you look up cotton fabric more so than any other cotton fabric. There are so many prints and so many colors, and like I said, different weights. They are generally plain weave, meaning just over, under, nothing fancy, no ridges, no fancy designs. Really plain, and then they are printed on one side. They are intended, as the name suggests, to be used for quilts, so the backside of the textile doesn't matter. This is something that you can use for historical things. There are some weights that are better for others. I definitely have used some lighter weight quilting cottons for things like 18th century summer gowns, but you gotta be picky about it. A lot of them are just going to be much heavier than you want. Also, some of those can end up being kind of a bear to stitch through. The heavier quilting cottons, the really tightly woven, stiff quilting cottons, do not hand stitch nicely. Do not recommend at all. So while there is a huge variety of prints, and some of them are even reproduction prints, though again, beware on that because a lot of the reproduction ones actually just scan the image of the antique in and then reprint it, dirt and all. You just have to be aware of the upsides and downsides. A lot of the printed cottons that were popular in, say, the 18th and 19th centuries were very, very lightweight. Which brings us to the lighter weight cottons. Now, this is where it's going to get a little confusing really fast. You have things like Batiste, lawn, and Voile. We're going to go through those three first. They are all technically plain weave sheer cottons that are not too stiff but are not too drapey. What is the difference between the three? That's a great question. Personally, I feel like usually Voile is a little more drapey than the other two, and sometimes I find that Batiste is the most stiff, but sometimes I see it argued that lawn is the most stiff. So here's the thing. All three of those terms are going to be used pretty much interchangeably when it comes to you purchasing modern fabric. That's just going to be the simple answer for it. If you're looking for something that is a lighter weight, sheer but not crazy sheer cotton, look up all three terms. On the slightly more sheer side, we have our cotton gauze. This is not more sheer because it is finer fibers, it's usually more sheer because they're spaced out further. So it's still a plain weave, sometimes you get a crinkly texture to it, but generally the fibers just have more gaps, and that's what makes it look and feel lighter weight and more sheer. Now, there's both regular gauze, and there is also double gauze. Double gauze is essentially two pieces of fabric that have been woven at the same time, and they sort of get connected by little threads throughout. It's really hard to see the threads. You won't necessarily, unless you're really pulling them apart and getting in there, notice that it is two separate layers. Double gauze is a very modern textile, but it does provide an interesting weight and texture. It's something that I've been really curious about and would like to try more, because just like quilting cotton, this has become very popular, and especially coming out of Japan, there are all sorts of wonderful prints and designs, so this might be something to look into further. The only downside is because it is a gauze, it does have those gaps, and it does make it a little bit more complex to hand stitch through with something that is a looser weave. You also have some slightly more complex versions of shears. You can have Swiss dots, which are an overall sheer fabric, but little specks woven in throughout. There are different sizes of dot, so there's not one universal size or style or pattern layout for a Swiss dot. They just have little opaque dots woven throughout. You'll also find a whole variety of sheer cottons that have different weaves in them, so that way they can alternate stripes between a open and a more closed up weave, or perhaps going from plain to satin, or adding in some other texture throughout. Again, these tend to fall under modern terms of lawn, Batiste, things like that, so that way you will still find them under the sheer cottons, they just happen to have complex weaves in them. There are technically other names for this that we'll get to, but you're gonna find those under that name pretty commonly. The last sheer cotton that we absolutely have to mention is organdy. Organdy is incredibly stiff sheer cotton. This is something that is really appropriate for accessories and ruffles, so 18th century caps or aprons, ruffles of different types. I have seen a lot of people modern use organdy as sort of an inner lining stiffening layer, but honestly, it's usually way too much for that. Instead of using cotton organdy for all of those inner linings where you need some stiffness, instead I highly recommend you look into tarlatan. Tarlatan is also a cotton textile and is historically what was used inside of pretty much everything in the 19th century. It's just everywhere. So it really is the better option rather than the overly stiff and entirely too paper-like organdy when it comes to internal structures. Organdy is so incredibly stiff and fights back the whole way, and theoretically the stiffening that is on it should be water-fast. It's not always, so you definitely have to check that. And I've had some people who have washed their organdy and found it softer, and then others that have found it crisped back up and sort of reinvigorated. So test that out before you wash the whole thing as well. Just adjacent to this family of sheer fibers, we have muslin. I'm not going to put it in these sheer cottons because while historically muslin did refer to sheer cottons, all of those gowns from the late 18th, early 19th century, the very diaphanous white cotton gowns, those were muslin gowns. However, today, we do not term muslin in the same way. It usually refers to a very inexpensive plain weave cotton that is meant for just the cheapest of cheap. It is the lining inside of pillows. It is what we make our mock-ups out of, the things that we want to test and then throw away. Sometimes you find it bleached or unbleached. It's just really inexpensive cotton. So historically, muslin meant something pretty dramatically different. Adjacent to that, we then move into the more opaque cottons. This is where we're going to find things like broadcloth or poplin. This is technically supposed to be a specific weave. It is a ridged weave, meaning it's still a plain weave, but it will have little ridges because the warp is a different size than the weft threads. So as the lighter weight threads run across the heavier weight threads, they will actually create ridges. And this is what technically a broadcloth or a poplin is. Now, when you look this up, you're still going to find some that are pretty plain weave without that ridge to them. This is the stuff that most basic cotton shirts are made out of today. It really is probably the most common cotton that we find in our wardrobe aside from knits, which we'll get to later. There are also some additional terms you might come across here, like Pimatex, which is a specific brand, Kona as well, another brand name. These are not different weaves or anything particularly special, it's just a literal brand name. You also have things like mercerized cotton, which is referring to a finishing process. So essentially what they've done is they have chemically altered the cotton fibers so that way they swell up and are more willing to accept dye and other processing. So if you are specifically dyeing cotton, mercerized cotton is probably your best way to go. Other similar names you might come across are Pima and Egyptian cotton. These are more commonly in things like sheets or clothing. They used to refer to a region that the cotton came from, but now it's more just a, I don't want to say quality exactly, but it should technically apply to a quality. So Egyptian cotton is supposed to be higher quality cotton. Same thing goes with Pima. These are used pretty liberally today, so take all of the terminology that comes with cotton like that with a grain of salt. There are also other finishes that you can do to these mid-weight sort of opaque cottons, like brushing them to get a fuzzy texture, which is going to be a little bit different than a cotton flannel, whereas a brushed cotton can be a plain weave or a twill weave, the twill weave being that sort of diagonal ribbing that you get from a different series of over-unders where you offset your overs and unders to give a diagonal pattern. That specifically can be brushed cotton either way, but flannel specifically is always that twill weave and is usually a very soft, very full, very fluffy type of cotton. Flannel is also one of those terms that we're going to hear about when we get to wool in the future. Now, if you don't want to brush down your cottons, you can also process them in other ways, such as glazing your cotton. This is where a very shiny finish is applied to the top of it. Again, you're going to most likely find this on plain weaves, but I have come across it on twill weaves as well. And this finish is not waterproof. So if you wash your fabric, if you get it wet, it can change the finish. What might get you a similar look but be washable is cotton sateen. This is woven instead of a plain weave with a satin weave, meaning that the top side has more long sections of thread. They skip over a whole bunch of threads and then go under. And so you see more soft, long threads on the top of your textile, much like silk satin. Cotton sateen will have a nice, smooth, soft, and somewhat shiny finish to it. This will not wash away in the same way and can be a great textile for lots of different applications. Glazed cotton was really popular in the 19th century as a lining, as the inner lining of bodices or as a separate lining in skirts, but cotton sateen, though very often in modern day a little bit softer, can substitute for that. It's not quite as ideal, it's not quite as stiff, though you could probably starch it into being just about as stiff. But then again, once you start adding moisture to the elements, it's not going to hold on to that stiffness in quite the same way. A quick note here on chambray, which is a more modern cotton that you're going to regularly find. Chambray specifically is woven in a plain weave using two different colors. So the warp threads will be a different color than the weft threads. Usually the warp threads are white and the weft threads are indigo or some other color, and so you will get sort of a two-tone effect to this, but that is what defines chambray in your modern wardrobe. Our heavier cotton textiles can be things like canvas or duck. We talked a little bit about canvases in Linen 101, but essentially it is a plain weave that is very stiff, very sturdy, and is really great for things like tents and sailcloth. It is not really meant for average fashionable uses. It is meant for more industrial and hard-wearing circumstances. There certainly are some lighter weight canvas materials that might do well for working trousers or heavier weight garments that need to hold up to a lot, but it's not really going to say do well in a gown or something of that nature. It is very much a working textile. Similar to this, we have denim, or jean cloth, as it was also known historically. Both terms were commonly used in reference to a twill weave textile that very often is on the heavier weight, more durable side, but it can actually be fairly lightweight as well. It doesn't have to be a specific weight. It doesn't have to be a specific color. Jean cloth in the 18th century wasn't necessarily in an indigo color. It was very commonly in a natural tone or all the way through brown. It's just a very durable and hard-wearing textile because of the weave. Then there are some of the more complex cottons, such as piqué, which is a fancy Marcella weave, and you will get all sorts of different repetitions here, but very often it has a little square checkerboard feel to it, or basket weave. This is something that was incredibly popular for men's vests and suiting. When you think of those really beautiful men's tailcoats from the beginning of the 20th century, that was a very common waistcoat textile to have made up, and it can be used in lots of other places as well. It's just a complex repetitive weave. Dimity has a similar concept to it. This is again a ridged textile, not unlike when we talked about broadcloth, but those were very, very tiny ridges. Dimity has much larger ridges. It's a little bit more notable and can be woven where it's not every single thread is a ridge, but you can make more complex designs in terms of these stripe patterns based off of these heavier threads running throughout. There is also seersucker, which is actually done by way of having strands of the warp thread running the long length of the textile being taut, and then the ones next to it for a section actually running at a slightly different speed and alternating that over and over again. So you get a flat stripe and then you get a sort of bubbly stripe. Supposedly, seersucker is really great for hot weather because of the extra air pockets that it allows for and keeps you cooler that way. I have not experimented with this, but seersucker is believed to be a great summer textile and therefore is found throughout the latter 19th and into the 20th century as a summer suiting, not only for men, but also in women's fashion pretty commonly. And there are lots of different types of seersucker. There's not just the really obvious big wide stripes. I've come across things that are called that are really narrow stripes. Probably shouldn't be considered a seersucker, but seems to be almost anything that has that really narrow ridge to it very often will be termed that, even if they are technically more like a dimity than a seersucker. So again, modern terminology that probably would be good looking at both, since dimity isn't always a common term today. Wrapping up with some of our more unique cottons, we of course have velveteen, which is the cotton form of velvet. It has a specifically different name than velvets do, which can be silk or actually wool as well. But velveteen is usually a fairly short pile. Cotton velveteen is actually a really great mimic of the weight that it used to be more common for silk velvets historically. Cotton velveteen has retained that sort of heavier backing and is sort of slinky in the way that most silk and rayon velvets are today. So it is a great substitute in terms of budget and availability for older types of silk velvet. Cotton velveteen, though, was really popular throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Manchester velvet is one of the particular names that you will see it mentioned under. I have come across lots of different things using this velvet, men's waistcoats, or different portions of these garments like collars and cuffs. I've even come across it in 18th century shoes before. I once made a pair of 18th century Manchester velvet shoes based off of an original pair at the Bata Shoe Museum. So velveteen is a particularly useful historic textile. If you want to then take this velveteen one step further, you can turn it into corduroy, which corduroy is where the original terminology of that comes from, and essentially it's taking a velvet and cutting channels into it. So it's actually not woven with that different variants to it, it's cut to have those ridges in there. And this is something that goes in and out of fashion in modern day and was pretty popular in the 18th and 19th centuries as well. And cut velvets certainly go back much further than that, and it can mimic certain types of cut velvets from earlier centuries really well. You just have to be aware of what size of wale the ridge, you need depending on the specific era. There are also more complex weaves like Matelassé, which is meant to be mimicking quilting. So Matelassé cottons are mock quilts, essentially. They are woven with those bubbles in them, not unlike sort of a combination of seersucker and double gauze, because they're woven with 2 layers. And some of the top layer is woven loose, some of it is woven to the layer underneath, and you end up with a faux quilting effect. This is something that was around for quite a while because it works really well as a lightweight but stiff textile that will hold your petticoats out and away from your body. There is also cotton net or cotton bobbinet. This can come in different weights and strengths and sizes of holes and gaps. So you have certain types that are really better suited towards lightweight trims and ruffles and accessories, and then you can also find heavier cotton netting, which is more appropriate to something like a summer corset, and I've even found it on summer shoes, particularly of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So there is a variety of different types of cotton net. It is usually less expensive, easier to find, and a little bit more stiff than silk net, and it's going to be less stiff than modern synthetic tools. And then of course the final one on our list is that of jersey knit, because you can't have cotton without having cotton knit. This is the most common version of cotton that we will find today. Cotton t-shirts, cotton knits of all types, just absolutely everywhere. There are a variety of different weights available, but cotton knit is what you're going to find for modern day socks and stockings most often. It can technically be used in a variety of places if you are trying to mimic knit textiles of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, but optimally you'd stick more to the 19th and 20th centuries where cotton really takes off, is legal to be used in all sorts of places, and is therefore being used in any place that they can possibly come up with. So cotton knit really takes off in the 19th century, and you even find it being regularly used as undergarments, and I do mean the undermost garments. So that really inexpensive cotton knit camisole that you bought at one of the modern shops and put under your corset instead of making proper underwear, guess what? It's actually pretty accurate. Go look at Abby's video about this. I love it. And honestly, it makes me want to just not bother with any of the fancy underwear. Okay, I'm lying. I really love the fancy underwear. But in terms of like practical times where no one's going to see the fancy underwear, cotton knits, man, like that is your best option by far. So that's something that is everywhere in modern day, but also super useful historically as well. And that's kind of the case with all of the cotton textiles. This is definitely a place where I know a lot of historic costumers start their journey with historic costuming. They start off purchasing cotton because it is so widely available, and it's usually less expensive than many of the other natural fibers. And that's great. You just need to be aware that sometimes linen might be a better option in terms of keeping it up against your body and staying clean, particularly if you are going into events where you're going to be spending a few days in costume and things can get kind of smelly. Cotton, though, is widely used in lots of different eras. It's available in so many different weaves and prints. You just have to spend a little bit more time doing the research to make sure that you get the right weight, you get the right prints, and then you will save on the money. So this is a great textile if you have time, but you don't necessarily have the investment to put into it. Cottons historically could be very expensive or very cheap, so they go either way on the scale, and lots of people historically would have cottons in their wardrobes. Obviously, less so in certain areas where it was illegal for a little while, but point is, they were certainly available in lots of different times and available to lots of different people. There are just going to be downsides to dealing with cotton in modern day simply due to the fact that there are so many amazing modern cottons out there that really were not available historically, but are incredibly prevalent and have saturated the market to the point where it's sometimes hard to find good historical cotton, but it really is one of the best textile places to start your journey into historical costumes because you can find some beautiful prints, you can find some cottons that feel fancy, feel really nice and really high quality without the budget of silk or some of the other natural fibers. Good now, obligatory puppy cuddles. Okay. And yes, she will will sit like this for hours if I let her.